The energy war has been escalating profusely, and we've talked about this on this show for the better part of a year. And we've talked about the possibility of targeting Russian oil refineries for the better part of years now on this program. But the escalating drone war we've talked about since the very start of the year, and how we're seeing more and more Ukrainian long-range drones go and target Russian oil infrastructure, go target Russian oil refineries. And as the Ukrainians have produced more drone this year than every other year of the war combined, that means more quantity to target these facilities. And these drones have also gotten more accurate, meaning instead of just ramming into some random like fuel storage container, you're ramming into the most vulnerable and most valuable components of the refinery process, the type of components that you're going to need to call foreign companies to import while under sanction, costing these companies money for the ones who do go through with the repairs and putting these refineries offline. This has led to roughly 20%, probably more, of Russia's oil refineries being knocked offline by this drone campaign. More than 1 in 5 Russian oil refineries knocked offline by the Ukrainian drone campaign. This has had two effects. Well, really 3 effects. The first effect is the gasoline shortage that we see across Russia. We see in rural regions lines of miles and miles and miles of cars of people waiting in line to get fuel at the gas station. I remember when I first crossed the border in 2022, seeing fuel queues that were not nearly as long as the ones we are seeing right now in Russia. And I'm talking April of 2022. I'm talking within a month and a half, a little bit more than a month and a half of the invasion starting, and these fuel queues that are starting in Russia, especially in the rural regions, are now exceeding that. We're seeing pretty high prices for fuel on the Russian black market, which more people are now pursuing, buying fuel out of people's backyard, people who are dealing that on the black market. And that personal crisis for Russians trying to get fuel is one element. Another element is that the Russian government has announced that they're not only going to suspend gasoline exports for the month of September, they've now extended it throughout the entirety of 2025. Through the rest of 2025, fuel exports, gasoline exports outside of Russia are banned. This is in order to try to stabilize the domestic fuel crisis that we were just talking about previously. And then there's a third effect, which is caused by the second, which is that if the refineries are blown up and they can't produce a product, they can't export the product. But if the economy has also said we're not going to export the gasoline, that means a lack of sales from these energy companies that are owned by friends of Vladimir Putin, allies of Vladimir Putin, that are, privately owned, but also tools of the state, and the state-owned energy companies as well. These companies not producing as much profit, not only not producing profit, losing money, means that the state loses money. If you lose the refineries, if you lose the foreign consumption due to Europe's sanctions or the rest of the sanctions, if you have to stop export, and that means you lose more export, more of this product being sold overseas, that means less profit for the companies that keep the economy afloat. So the Russian economy faces a few problems. So they face the problem of the fuel shortages in the rural regions. They face the problem of the suspension of gasoline exports, which is cutting into their profits. And they face the problem of these energy companies not being as profitable as they used to be, which has led the government to pursue other ways of making revenue. There's been considerations of social services cuts, but the one thing that's being rumored right now is a VAT tax increase. And this comes after Vladimir Putin said clearly that they are not going to increase taxes in relation to the war. But a VAT tax will be passed down to the Russian consumer as it is applied. My gosh, I've lost the English language. Completely lost this grasp. As it is applied at different parts of the production process. So that's the situation in Russia energy-wise right now. If you were to try to fill up your tank over there as an American, it would still be a lot cheaper, but we also need to understand how much Russians are making in relation to us. Somebody might throw out like, hey, here's how much it costs to fill up your tank in Russia. like Tucker Carlson did when at the grocery store, but that's in relation to what? You making American wages, not you making Russian wages. And so with the fuel shortages and with the exports being banned and with price increases generally across the board and the inflation problem in Russia, the economy faces a few problems. But in this specific sector, I expect not only the targeting of the refineries to get worse, especially as the Trump government has said that they're going to work. They haven't said it, but this has been reported by the Wall Street Journal, that they're giving the Ukrainians intelligence on Russian fuel infrastructure. While it looks like they're not going to get the Tomahawk missiles that's been talked about as of recent years, as of the last year, but especially recently as it was rumored that it was being discussed, and then it was declared by J.D. Vance and others like Keith Kellogg that it is being discussed, that is not going to go to Ukraine, probably. They have their own allocated needs for the Tomahawk missiles for the United States Armed Forces. If they get other missiles, maybe I could see them getting different cruise missiles, but not Tomahawks. But the point is that the government is currently in talks with the United States, not only to get that intelligence to help better target Russian oil refineries, but to also get the missiles that can target Russian oil refineries, that can better penetrate the air defense systems that are stretched out across the larger country on the planet. So this is the energy problem on one aspect. Here's the second aspect, though. It's one thing to target the refinery. It's one thing to target the production process. What if you just skip all that and go towards the end? Well, the Russians are approaching it that way when it comes to Ukrainian energy. It's wintertime. It is wintertime. And I can tell you, while, some people might call it fall, it is cold here in Kyiv. I have my jacket. I'm no longer walking to this office at night in my t-shirt. It's cold, and it's only going to get more cold. And every winter, the Russians have this tendency to target energy infrastructure to intensify that cold when it comes to Ukrainians, whether it's an attempt to target the energy production that powers the factories that produce weapons, whether it's an attempt to target the energy production which helps heat homes and helps keeps the power on, whether it's a combination of both, which is what I think is probably likely. The Russians are targeting Ukrainian energy infrastructure once again as we head into the winter months, where Ukrainians are going to be doing their best to stay warm. As we can see here is footage of the Russians targeting an electrical substation in the Kyiv Oblast in northern Ukraine. This is not the only instance of this happening, and we can expect this to continue to intensify, especially in the month of October, leading up into November and December, when it's going to be particularly cold. They want to get the least energy being sent into Ukrainian homes for the key months of November, December, January, and February, when it's going to be the coldest in the country. And it's already the start of October, and I can tell you, it's pretty goddamn cold right now, and it's only going to get colder. There's no heat in my apartment yet. The Ukrainians are preparing for this outcome and are holding back on heat for a lot of civilian homes and waiting until the last possible moment because they want to preserve. There is heat going into, of course, hospital situations, areas of public use. But the Russian campaign to target the Ukrainian electrical infrastructure heading into winter has certainly begun. And in fact, it has not just begun, it is underway. Here's the problem Russia faces, though. The Ukrainians have more tools at their disposal to throw this right back at them. Here is footage from the Luch substation in the Belgorod region. After this attack, this drone attack on this substation, Belgorod faced power outages in the region. Now, the regional government said that it was completely unrelated to the power station exploding. But, you can determine that yourself. You can see it burning clearly here. And I think there is one video here. I thought this was the video of the explosion. Here it is. Here's a video I wanted to show. Here is the moment of impact.
Разъебывают, пидорас. Да ну нахуй, пизда, Бурыч, смотри. Охуеть, куда мы попали? Вот это аттракцион, блядь. Нас остановили.
We got some Russian philosophers filming this right here. So The difference between 2022 and now, the difference between 2023 in the campaign against Ukrainian energy infrastructure and now, is the Ukrainians now have the tools to target Russian energy infrastructure at scale. Being able to target one substation, one power station, one this, one that, that doesn't fuck that. That means nothing. But if you're able to target it at scale and then immediately follow it up, that's a different situation. When it really got difficult for the refineries, and when the percentage of refineries that are out of commission really started to increase, was when they would repair these refineries and then a week later another drone would come. Namely, that was also when the refineries in Nazi Germany during the Second World War became basically defunct. When not only were they under attack and they had some bombings, but when the repairs and during the repair process and after they finished the repair process, they would immediately be followed up by more bombing, by more targeting, by more destruction for their energy production and their fuel production needs. And so Ukraine has more drones at their disposal at this point than at any other point in the war. And so if the Russians choose to once again engage in an energy campaign against the Ukrainians to knock out the electrical infrastructure that is keeping houses with the lights on and keeping houses warm, then we cannot be surprised when the Ukrainians do the exact same thing back. In fact, this Belgorod strike was from last month, late September. So the Ukrainians already have their signal sent clearly to the Russians on what they're able to do and what they're willing to do. It's now just a question of whether they were going to do that at scale across the country. Now, here's the difficult question for the Ukrainian armed forces. Now, the more drones they produce, the less difficult of a question this becomes. But there are drone production facilities in Russia. There are missile production facilities in Russia. There are artillery production facilities in Russia. There are armored vehicle production facilities in Russia. There are training facilities in Russia, training Russian soldiers to go into Ukraine and help the illegal invasion. They have all sorts of different locations across Russia that could be of strategic use to strike. And of course, the refinery campaign, which has had marquee success in the last months. So if the Russians start targeting Ukrainian energy infrastructure and the Ukrainians respond by targeting Russian energy infrastructure, they may be able to knock out the power like they did in Belgorod. They may be able to repeat that effort all across Russia. Maybe they'll do it in Moscow. Maybe they'll do it in St. Petersburg. Maybe they'll do it in other areas across Russia. But you only have so many drones. You only have so many munitions. And you have to choose your targets wisely. And while the energy infrastructure is a way to put direct, immediate pressure on the civilian population, and of course, energy, the electrical plants and the electricity going out to these factories help keep these factories going, I would argue that there is more of a need for the long-term pressure campaign to apply as much destruction as physically possible to Russian refineries across Russia, which are directly financing the war, and is part of the reason why the Russians are dealing with this fuel crisis to begin with. The one that has started these fuel queues around Russia. So I'm not saying that they shouldn't do this, even though I would prefer a situation where both sides see, hey, the Russians see the Ukrainians can strike their energy infrastructure. Ukrainians obviously see the Russians can strike theirs. Let's just not do that. It doesn't even need to be an implicit, they come out and say, let's not strike each other's energy infrastructure. It can be the Russians stop, the Ukrainians stop, both of them stop targeting power plants, both of them stop targeting electrical substations, and then it's over. The Ukrainian response to the Russian targeting of their electrical infrastructure ends, their attacks on electrical infrastructure end, and instead they target factories, instead they target training grounds, instead they target the more typical military targets that don't also service the civilian population directly, that don't also power hospitals, that don't also power local apartments in the winter. But so far, the Russians seem keen to target the electrical substations, and so I think that the energy war right now is on a pathway to escalating, to seeing more attacks on substations, not less, more attacks on power plants, not less, especially as we get deeper and deeper into the month of October, as every energy infrastructure ceasefire put forward so far has failed. You guys might have forgotten. I haven't forgotten. Remember that we should still actually be in an energy ceasefire right now. Donald Trump negotiated an energy ceasefire with the Russians that he was very proud to go on social media and brag about. This was like 6-7 months ago. And I remember hearing about these other ceasefires and, oh, we need a ceasefire this day by this day. And I was on the front line listening to the bombing. It's not happening. But the energy ceasefire failed almost immediately. Within 24 hours, Ukrainian energy infrastructure was being targeted. So the attempts to do an energy ceasefire through the Trump administration obviously failed. And I don't know how the situation has substantially changed outside of the capacity for Ukraine to throw in more drones since then, and Russian ability to maneuver around Ukrainian air defense systems. What I mean by that is that there are recent reports that Russian ballistic missiles are having much higher success rates in penetrating Ukrainian air defense systems due to last-minute maneuvers that Russian engineers have programmed into the systems, which have led to a much lower intercept rate, with the vast majority of Russian missiles now not being intercepted. So I expect the energy war over this winter to be particularly bad. All the ceasefire proposals put forward on energy have failed, and they failed in spectacular, immediate, and embarrassing fashion. The Russians are targeting electrical substation. They're targeting power plants. The Ukrainians are also targeting them in kind, and neither have sent any signals either from Putin's speech today or from recent statements from Zelensky's government or from any statements from Trump on any success of either bringing that back or there's been nothing, no movement, nada, zilch. And so at this point, my expectation is that it's going to be a difficult winter for civilians, that Russian and Ukrainian civilians are going to have their power knocked out more than once. The question is going to be, for me, how much will the Ukrainians prioritize going after this energy infrastructure of Russia when it comes to the delivery of electricity versus the other assets that they desperately need to target, like shell production, like training grounds, like the actual refineries that are making the Russian government money. I understand that the refineries, part of the purpose is to maybe hurt those oil queues, those fuel queues a little bit more, add more public pressure, and energy outages would add more pressure. But there has to be a question of priorities. And if you're seeing success in an area, if the Ukrainians should do anything, it is throw as much resources in the area of success as physically possible. If they find a vulnerability, take your thumb and dig it in that wound and dig it around till you see them squeal. That makes sense. Definitely if the goal of both the Trump administration and the Ukrainian government is to make the Russians believe that they can no longer continue the war. It's one thing to make it so it actually is unsustainable. A government can live in denial. You need to make it so devastating that they cannot live in denial, that it is impossible to see the situation as it is. And I don't know if this energy war is going to do that, but I know it's going to hurt.